Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into, it's a really disturbing issue that's been bubbling under the surface in the UK. The widespread sexual exploitation of young girls by organized groups.
Yeah,
You shared a GB News segment with us that really lays it all out there.
right.
And we're here to break it down with you. The complexities, the key players, and the shocking truths that are revealed.
It's not just about individual crimes, though. This points to something much bigger.
Yeah.
It's about institutions failing, victims being silenced, and a culture of fear that's actually preventing justice from being served. What we'll uncover is a web of interconnected failures across law enforcement, social services, and even the media.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
The GB News segment uses the Rotherham scandal as a prime example.
Right.
And the sheer scale of it is just staggering. This 2014 inquiry revealed that an estimated 1,400 children, mostly white girls, were sexually exploited by predominantly Pakistani men between 1997 and 2013. What's even more disturbing is that authorities knew what was happening but didn't act because they were afraid of being labeled racist.
This is where it gets really interesting. We see how the desire to be politically correct, to avoid being seen as racist, might have actually hindered the ability to protect these young girls.
Right.
It's a complex situation where the fear of appearing prejudiced can sometimes paralyze institutions, preventing them from taking necessary action.
And this leads to devastating consequences.
Right.
In Rotherham, 1 in 73 British Pakistani men were prosecuted for these crimes.
Wow.
That number alone should have been a huge red flag.
You would think.
But it seems like those in power chose to ignore it. How can we reconcile the need for cultural sensitivity with the urgency of protecting children?
That's a question a lot of people are grappling with.
Yeah.
How do we have these difficult conversations about ethnicity and crime without falling into harmful stereotypes? It requires nuance. It requires careful examination of the facts, and it requires a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
The GB News segment goes on to highlight how widespread these failures seem to be.
Right.
This wasn't just happening in Rotherham. It was happening across the UK. They share a story from a former police officer who describes encountering young girls in compromising situations with older men. Instead of investigating the men, they would often arrest the girls.
Think about the message that sends to a young victim.
Yeah.
It reinforces the idea that they are to blame, that they won't be believed, and that seeking help will only result in further harm. It's a heartbreaking failure of the system to protect those who need it most.
It's truly infuriating. The officer in the segment said police would often dismiss the victim's claims, citing consent,
Oh my.
even though the girls were underage and often intoxicated or drugged. That's not consent.
Yeah.
That's exploitation, plain and simple.
And this points to another layer of the problem, the legal framework itself. Was there something in the way the law was written or the way consent was defined that allowed this to happen? It's essential to look not just at individual cases, but at the systemic issues that might have enabled this abuse.
The GB News segment goes even further, sharing an anecdote about police actually being present at a location where underage girls were found with adult men.
Oh, wow.
But instead of investigating the men, they arrested the girls.
Wow.
This is a complete breakdown in the system's ability to protect these vulnerable children.
And it raises some critical questions about the culture within law enforcement.
Right.
What kind of training did these officers receive? Were there clear protocols in place for handling these situations? Or was there a systemic bias that led them to view the girls as the problem rather than the victims?
It's just unbelievable. Sadly, the police weren't the only ones failing these girls. The GB News segment highlights the role of the media in this whole mess as well. Major outlets like Channel 4 and the BBC, instead of focusing on the widespread verified abuse, actually ran documentaries questioning the validity of grooming gang accusations.
The media has a responsibility to report on these issues accurately and responsibly. When they choose to focus on alleged false accusations, it creates a climate of doubt that makes it even harder for victims to come forward. It's a classic tactic used to undermine legitimate claims and deflect attention away from the real problem.
You're right. They highlighted documentaries like Liar, the fake grooming gang scandal, which is adding insult to injury for these victims.
The choice to air a program with that title is incredibly telling.
Right.
It suggests a predisposition to view these claims with skepticism, even when there's substantial evidence to support them. It makes you wonder, were they intentionally trying to downplay the issue, or were they simply caught up in a misguided attempt to appear impartial? Regardless of their intent, the result was to silence victims and protect the perpetrators.
Exactly. And speaking of protecting perpetrators, the GB News segment also exposed some shocking failures in the justice system itself.
Yeah.
They mention a case where a convicted grooming gang member was able to avoid deportation by claiming he was gay and would be persecuted in his home country.
That reveals a potential loophole in the system.
Yeah.
Could this be something that's being exploited more widely? The segment also mentions another case from Rochdale where attackers were set for deportation but were allowed to remain in Britain. It seems like every step of the way, the system is working against the victims and in favor of the abusers.
The segment notes that the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer,
Yeah.
was the Director of Public Prosecutions during this time.
Oh, wow.
I think this is where things start to get really complex.
Now, that's a significant detail.
Yeah.
While Starmer did implement some reforms to increase prosecutions during his time as DPP, there has been criticism about his overall handling of this issue. What were those reforms, and were they effective? What were the specific criticisms leveled against him, and how do they relate to the broader failures we've been discussing?
The GB News segment also brings up Maggie Oliver.
Right.
She's a former Greater Manchester police detective turned whistleblower. And she has directly accused Starmer of being complicit in the failures to address these grooming gangs.
Her perspective is incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Because as a police officer, she saw firsthand how the system was failing these girls. She was on the inside. The fact that she risked her career to speak out against it really makes her accusations against Starmer carry a lot of weight. It raises questions about the culture of silence within law enforcement and the challenges faced by those who try to speak truth to power.
Absolutely. Now, in light of all of this,
Yeah.
there are growing calls for a full national inquiry to investigate the systemic issues that allowed these crimes to continue for decades.
This is a crucial step towards uncovering the full truth. A national inquiry has the power to compel testimony and gather evidence from across multiple jurisdictions. This isn't about assigning blame, it's about understanding how this was allowed to happen, who was responsible, and what needs to change to prevent it from happening again.
The GB News segment mentions that even Elon Musk publicly supported the calls for a national inquiry.
Interesting.
So this topic is clearly resonating with people from all walks of life. There is also support from various victims' rights groups and individuals who have been tirelessly working to bring this issue to light.
What's interesting here is that this isn't a partisan issue.
Right.
We see support coming from both sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
This suggests that the public at large recognizes the gravity of the situation and the need for a thorough and impartial investigation.
However, the GB News segment also highlights the resistance to a national inquiry from some government officials like Jess Phillips, who favors local inquiries. This raises the question, what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of each approach? Could local inquiries potentially miss the bigger picture, the systemic issues that a national inquiry could uncover?
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
While local inquiries can provide valuable insight into specific situations, they might not have the scope or authority to address the broader cultural and institutional factors that contributed to these crimes.
Before we go any further, I think it's important to pause and acknowledge the devastating impact that these crimes have had on the victims. We've been talking about systems and institutions, but ultimately, this is about real people whose lives have been shattered.
Absolutely. The trauma these young girls have endured is unimaginable. They were robbed of their childhoods, their innocence, their sense of safety. The long-term psychological and emotional scars of this abuse are immeasurable.
And what makes this even more tragic is that it was preventable.
Right.
If the authorities had acted when they first became aware of these crimes, countless lives could have been spared this horrific trauma.
That's what makes this so difficult to process.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual acts of cruelty. It's about a collective failure to protect the most vulnerable members of our society.
Yeah.
It raises profound questions about our values, our institutions, and our responsibility to one another. You're absolutely right. This wasn't simply a few individuals making bad choices.
Right.
This was a failure of the entire system.
Yeah.
And that's why a national inquiry is so important. We need to understand how this was allowed to happen, who is responsible, and what needs to change to prevent this from ever happening again.
The GB News segment really emphasizes the urgency of this. They argue that this inquiry should be the most important one this country has ever had.
Whoa.
They even said it should be more important than inquiries into the Grenfell Tower fire or the post office scandal.
And it's hard to argue with that.
Right.
When you consider the scale and the severity of the abuse, the length of time it went unchecked, and how many institutions failed these children, it really does make this a horrific chapter in British history.
This segment also brings up a really disturbing thought. They say that evidence could be being destroyed right now,
Oh, gosh.
with people shredding documents and deleting emails to cover their tracks.
If true, that speaks to how deeply rooted this problem is.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what are they so afraid of uncovering?
Absolutely. Now, the GB News segment also brings up another important aspect of this entire scandal: the role of political correctness. They talk about how fear of being labeled racist or Islamophobic really seemed to paralyze those in positions of power.
It's a tragic irony. In an attempt to avoid accusations of prejudice, they might have ended up enabling horrific abuse.
Right.
They included a clip of Keir Starmer where he downplays the role of ethnicity in these crimes.
Yeah.
But then they pointed to that statistic again. 1 in 73 British Pakistani men in Rotherham were prosecuted for these offenses.
Right.
That number suggests that ethnicity can't be ignored.
It seems like the desire to be politically correct actually prevented people from having honest and open conversations about the root causes of this problem.
That's a point worth exploring further. The GB News panel brought up this idea that the fear of causing racial divisions is likely playing a huge role in the resistance to a national inquiry. They seem to think that if the full truth came out, it could potentially lead to social unrest.
But wouldn't that be even more of a reason to have an inquiry?
Right.
Sweeping this under the rug won't make the problem go away.
No.
In fact, it might just allow the problem to fester and potentially grow even worse.
That's a perspective that often gets lost in these discussions.
Yeah.
Transparency, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, is often the best path towards lasting solutions.
The GB News segment highlights their anger and frustration at the lack of accountability.
It's understandable that they would feel that way.
Yeah.
Imagine how those victims must feel.
Oh, I know.
Seeing their abusers walking free,
Right.
knowing that the system failed to protect them. The GB News segment had some really powerful quotes from people who are outraged by the lack of action and what they perceive as indifference from those in power.
One of the panelists on the show even calls for chemical castration and deportation for anyone who commits sexual assault in the UK.
Wow.
While that's definitely a strong stance, it really shows how deeply this issue has affected people.
It reflects a level of anger and desperation that shouldn't be ignored.
Right.
It also raises important questions about the purpose of punishment. Is it about retribution, rehabilitation, or protecting society?
Yeah.
How do we balance the rights of the offender with the need for justice and the safety of the community?
This segment also discusses the fact that there have already been some local inquiries, but they argue that those are not enough. They point out that no one has actually been held accountable,
Right.
and there has been very little real change as a result of those inquiries.
That's a valid point. A local inquiry can only go so far. It might uncover wrongdoing at a local level, but it can't address the larger systemic issues that allow this to happen on a national scale. Only a full national inquiry, with the power to compel testimony and investigate across multiple jurisdictions, can truly get to the bottom of this.
And as we've already mentioned, there seems to be some resistance to a national inquiry.
Yeah.
The segment highlights Jess Phillips' stance favoring local inquiries,
Okay.
and how both the Conservative and Labour parties have historically opposed a national inquiry.
It's not just a partisan issue either.
Right.
Both major political parties seem to be resistant to a full-blown investigation.
Yeah.
What could explain this resistance across party lines? The GB News segment speculates that it might stem from a fear of what an inquiry could reveal. They even say that the problem might be even bigger than anyone realizes.
Wow.
And the inquiry could expose a level of complicity and corruption that would be deeply damaging to the establishment.
That's a serious allegation.
It is.
It raises some critical questions about transparency and accountability in government. If those in power are actively suppressing an inquiry because they fear the consequences, that in itself is a major scandal.
Absolutely. The GB News segment ends with a plea for accountability.
Right.
They argue that the victims deserve justice, and that the only way to achieve that is through a thorough and transparent investigation.
They are calling for more than just answers.
Yeah.
They are calling for a reckoning.
Hmm.
It's a demand for justice, not just for the individual victims, but for a system that failed to protect them. They are demanding a recognition of the harm that has been done and a commitment to prevent it from happening again.
That's a powerful message to end on.
It is.
This isn't just a story about a few isolated incidents. It's about systemic failure.
Right.
It's about the silencing of victims and the dangers of prioritizing political correctness over the safety and well-being of vulnerable children. It's a story that should make us all angry, but it's also a story that should motivate us to demand change.
We've talked a lot about the failures of institutions.
Yeah.
But ultimately, this is about a failure of empathy, a failure to see the humanity in these young girls and to prioritize their safety and well-being above all else.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has revealed some truly disturbing truths. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of this problem, but it's important to remember that we can make a difference. What can we do to create change and make sure this never happens again?
Well, I think it starts with awareness. This deep dive into the GB News segment, it's really shed light on a problem that has been hidden for far too long. The more people who know about this issue, the more pressure we can put on those in power to actually take action.
You're absolutely right. That pressure needs to come from everywhere, from the public, from the media, from within the institutions themselves.
Exactly. We need journalists who are willing to investigate and expose the truth, even when it's difficult. We need law enforcement officials who prioritize the safety of children over political convenience. And we need a justice system that holds abusers accountable, no matter who they are or what their connections might be.
The GB News segment showed how the system failed these girls at every level. It's not just about fixing one part of the system. It seems like a complete overhaul is needed.
Yeah, we need a fundamental shift in how we view and address these issues. We have to move past the fear of being labeled racist or Islamophobic and focus on protecting the most vulnerable members of society. These are difficult conversations to have, but they are essential if we want to create real change.
The GB News segment highlighted the story of Maggie Oliver, the whistleblower who risked her career to expose what was happening. We need more people like her, who are willing to stand up and speak out against injustice, even when it's hard.
Her story is inspiring, and it's a reminder that change often comes from within. We can't just sit back and wait for those in power to do the right thing. It's up to all of us to speak out, to demand better, and to hold our leaders accountable.
The GB News panel discussed the possibility of a privately funded inquiry if the government continues to resist calls for a national one. That shows how determined people are to get to the bottom of this and get answers.
It is encouraging to see that level of commitment. It shows that people aren't willing to let this be swept under the rug. Regardless of who funds the inquiry, the important thing is that it's conducted thoroughly and impartially.
You're right. The truth needs to come out no matter what. The GB News segment raised a really thought-provoking question. If the fear of being called racist can silence such widespread abuse, what other problems might be hidden because people are afraid to speak out?
That's a question we all need to ask ourselves. It makes you wonder how many other injustices are being ignored or downplayed because people are afraid of the consequences of speaking up.
This deep dive has shown a dark side of our society, but it has also shown the power of speaking truth to power. We can't let fear silence us. It's up to all of us to keep shining a light on these issues, to keep demanding accountability, and to work towards creating a world where every child is safe and protected.
This conversation needs to continue. We need to keep pushing for answers, for accountability, and for real change. We need to hold our leaders accountable for creating a society that truly protects its most vulnerable members. This deep dive was just the beginning. Now it's up to all of us to carry the torch and work for a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.